very disruptive to raise your children on a sinking ship. And if you don't think Canada's a sinking ship, you're an idiot.
But I will tell you, they have been very difficult to deal with. They're very spoiled.
I would deport Justin Trudeau the first day in office. That guy sucks.
Today for our daily cancellation, we go up to Canada, a country that achieves very little and serves no real purpose.
When will we put an end to this wacko policy by this wacko Prime Minister?
No. Canada used to be one of the most sought-after nations to migrate to from around the world if you wanted to achieve success. But recently, many Canadians have started leaving Canada in droves, and complaints about how shitty living in Canada has become are flooding the internet.
Canada is communist. They got to get rid of that guy.
I recently moved from Canada, and I can say one thing. America is great. Canada is screwed up.
From the rising cost of living, the unbelievably bad housing crisis, the disastrous public healthcare system, extremely high tax rates, suffocating overregulations, and perhaps most importantly, immigration, everything seems to be falling apart over in Canada. And many say that this man is to blame.
We have a weak Prime Minister who's lost control of everything.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faced public backlash.
Oh, you're a fucking dictator. Oh, you don't like criticism.
Prime Minister has lost the confidence of Canadians.
I am absolutely glad that this wacko shithead is leaving.
Is he really to blame? What exactly happened to Canada? Let's rewind to 2015. At just 43 years old, Trudeau had it all: charisma, energy, and that last name. He wasn't just any politician. He was the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, one of Canada's most iconic leaders. For many, he was a symbol of hope and nostalgia, a reminder of Canada's glory days and that Canadian pride which many were yearning for once more.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
His campaign promised exactly what people wanted to hear: hope, progress, and most importantly, change. And oh man, did he promise a ton, but it worked. In one of the most dramatic comebacks in Canadian political history, the Liberals went from third-party status to a majority government. Trudeau swept through provinces like Ontario, dominated urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver, and also rallied young voters to hit the polls in record numbers. Overnight, Trudeau became the poster boy for progressive politics, not just in Canada, but around the world. Early on, he delivered on big promises, like legalizing marijuana and welcoming tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. It seemed like the sunny ways dream was becoming a reality. But then, it didn't. What went wrong? And how did Canada end up here? By 2024, the cost of living is higher than ever. Groceries are more expensive, gas prices are through the roof, rent and home prices have skyrocketed to the point where owning a home is a pipe dream for many Canadians. And wages? Well, it's funny you should ask. When Trudeau took office in 2015, he promised to support the middle class and make life more affordable. Instead, as we already mentioned, by the end of 2024, the cost of living has spiraled out of control, and Trudeau's policies have directly contributed to the problem. Let's start with food. In 2024, the average Canadian household spent 11% more on groceries than they did just 3 years ago, with basic items like milk, bread, and vegetables increasing even more. Why? A good chunk of the blame lies with Trudeau's carbon tax. Farmers and food producers face higher costs for fuel, heating, and transportation, all of which gets passed down to the consumer. For example, the carbon tax on diesel, a necessity for farm equipment and food transport, has increased by 240% since 2019. Basically, Trudeau made it more expensive for anyone to produce anything domestically in Canada, which obviously hurts the domestic economy, but also makes imports more competitive compared to the domestic economy.
We have more Canadians than ever relying on assistance just to eat.
More and more people are compromising nutrition due to high food prices.
Then there are energy costs, which, you guessed it, are also through the roof. By 2024, the average household pays $352 more annually on utilities compared to when Trudeau first implemented the carbon tax policy. This includes things like electricity, heating, and gas. Families in colder provinces like Alberta and Manitoba have it even worse since they rely more heavily on natural gas for heating during the very cold Canadian winters.
I just got my electricity bill from Toronto Hydro. They bill every 2 months. Take a look at this. It's an electricity bill for $1,123, so $663 for electricity. Triple what Americans would pay. But then another $460 on top of that for delivery fees and taxes and regulations. And the Ontario government says it's all going to keep going up and up and up, and the next increase is in just 3 weeks. This is energy poverty.
Childcare has also become extremely expensive, and to address the issue, Trudeau has decided instead of perhaps lowering the taxes that Canadians have to fork over from their own hard labor, he would raise taxes even higher and then return some of it to Canadians through various forms of welfare, like the $10 a day childcare program. Needless to say, it's been a disaster, just like all other government welfare tends to be. And the wait lists stretch for years because, as we've learned on this channel, capping the price on anything always creates a big, fat shortage. Meanwhile, for those unlucky enough to not be accepted into the program, daycare fees average as much as $1,500 per month per child in major cities. Trudeau also increased everyone's gas prices, again by taxing gasoline an additional 17 cents per liter since 2019. This means an average driver spends an additional $408 on average per year filling up their tank. But it's not just the drivers, since taxing fuel increases the prices of absolutely all goods, since everything needs to be transported and delivered from place to place.
More than half of drivers say they're getting behind the wheel less due to the skyrocketing gas prices, according to a recent survey.
Gas prices are set to jump significantly overnight.
You don't want to go too far with the price of gas.
In Ottawa, we're projected to see gas go up by 4 cents on Saturday.
Sometimes I even think it's just cheaper to Uber places.
Another reason for rising prices in Canada is additional taxes levied on employers like the Canadian Pension Plan and the escalating payroll taxes for all businesses. When it's more expensive to hire workers, either the worker's paycheck is going to be smaller or you're going to have to pay higher prices for the goods you're buying. Nobody wins. Well, except Trudeau's government that gets to put their fat, greasy hands in your pocket once again. Trudeau's defenders might point to external factors like the pandemic and global inflation, but these idiotic policies are the reason Canada is doing so much worse than other nations who didn't implement similar measures, not the pandemic. Other countries also had to go through the pandemic, but Canada is lagging behind them. Canadians really are just struggling to afford the basics. And one of those basics is housing. And oh boy, do we have a lot to talk about here. It really is catastrophic. And even that is probably an understatement. Trudeau's government has essentially doubled the price of an average home, which in 2024 exceeds $730,000. Yes, $730,000. That's not a typo. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, it's far worse, with homes selling for well over $1.2 million on average. Meanwhile, rent prices have skyrocketed as well, with the national average rent for a one-bedroom apartment reaching $1,800 per month, a 20% increase in just 2 years.
So they go up 300 to 400%. They go up faster. Not only are the housing prices going up, but the slope of the housing prices going up is going up.
So what's driving this crisis? While rising demand and population growth play a role, and many people, particularly those on the right, tend to blame immigration, it's not really the root cause. In a free market, when there is an influx of people seeking to live in a certain area, the developers respond by building more housing to meet the new demand. No, that's not the case. Something else is the real culprit here, and those are the policies and regulations that make it nearly impossible to build enough homes to meet that demand. First, there's the red tape strangling developers, and some of these stories make you want to pull your hair out. The federal government's National Housing Strategy, introduced in 2017, promised to make housing more affordable, but instead it created more bureaucratic hurdles. Now developers face layers of regulations at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels, from environmental assessments to various random regulations that serve little to no purpose. In Vancouver, for example, it takes over 2 years on average to get approved for a multifamily housing project, by which time construction costs have already increased, so the prices are pushed even higher. Then there's the issue of zoning laws. These laws prevent high-density housing from being built in many neighborhoods, especially those dominated by single-family homes. In Toronto, only 20% of the city's land is zoned for multifamily housing, despite growing demand. If developers were allowed to build multifamily housing anywhere, they would, because it would bring them more profit. Then, very quickly, the supply of housing would increase, pushing the prices back down. But try explaining that to useless government bureaucrats. Then there are the fees. Oh, the fees. In cities like Vancouver and Toronto, development fees can account for as much as 20% of a project's total cost. These fees include everything from infrastructure levies to community benefit charges, which are ultimately passed on to home buyers because, of course, they are. You wouldn't build anything to lose money. Trudeau also introduced the first-time home buyer incentive program, which was supposed to help Canadians get into the housing market. But the program has, you guessed it, failed. By capping the price of eligible homes, it excluded buyers in hot markets like Toronto and Vancouver, where the crisis is arguably the worst. Instead of me blabbering on, I'd like to turn it over to a very good friend of mine who is a developer in Vancouver and so knows the ins and outs of the business.
As a contractor and construction firm in the Vancouver area, I've seen the housing crisis play out in real time. Building homes, it's no walk in the park. There are so many challenges, and it feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps back. So, why are we dealing with such a massive housing shortage in Canada? From where I stand, one big reason is that it's just too hard to get things built. There are so many rules and restrictions that it feels like we're jumping through hoops just to lay down a basic foundation. Let's be honest, they've created this huge bottleneck that makes it nearly impossible to keep up with demand. Take zoning laws, for example. These things are outdated and way too restrictive. They're locking up huge areas of land where you could have built more homes, but instead you're stuck with single family houses only. You're just not allowed to go vertical. And then there's the permitting process. Don't even get me started. It's an endless maze of paperwork and approvals that drags on and on forever. Then there are provincial and local governments. I mean, Vancouver is an amazing city, but trying to get a project approved here is like running a marathon with your shoelaces tied together. They pile on layers of red tape with rezoning, environmental reviews, and community consultations. Sure, these things are important, but do they need to take years? It's hard to stay motivated when every step of the process literally feels like quicksand. I've got a story that really drives this home. We were working on a project to build affordable housing in a growing neighborhood, but it took over 2 years just to get through the zoning and consultation phase. Then they hit us with requirements for extra environmental reports. And keep in mind, this was an already developed urban area. By the time we got the green light, costs have gone up so much that the affordable part of the housing was barely affordable anymore. Community consultations are a whole nother thing. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for listening to people's concern, but sometimes it's just a way to block progress. People bring things up like noise, traffic, or how a new building might look, and suddenly the whole project is stuck in limbo. I get it, change can be hard, but at some point we've got to ask what's more important, keeping things the same or making sure people have a place to live. And let's talk about the rules for sustainability. I'm all for building green and energy efficient homes, but sometimes these policies feel more like roadblocks than solutions. For one project, we had to install cutting edge energy systems that were so new they weren't even widely available yet. It added months of delays and got a ton of extra cost. I'm all for saving the planet, but we got to find a balance that doesn't leave builders and buyers paying the price. At the end of the day, this housing crisis is something that we need to tackle together. Builders like me are ready to do the work, but we need governments to meet us halfway. Let's simplify the processes, rethink the rules, and speed things up so we can start putting roofs over people's heads.
And let's not forget the foreign buyers ban, introduced in 2023 to curb speculation. While it sounded good in theory, it ignored the fact that foreign ownership accounts for less than 5% of the market in most Canadian cities. The ban did nothing to address the core issue. There simply aren't enough homes for the people already living in Canada. And if you want to address the issue at all whatsoever, you need to build more. The result of these policies? A perfect storm of high demand, low supply, and skyrocketing prices. Canadians are left scrambling for housing while developers are tied up in endless paperwork and fees. And owning a home has become just a dream for a large number of Canadians. Can you guess how much money a Canadian needs to make on a yearly basis to qualify for a mortgage on an average home? $155,000 a year. And how much do you think an average Canadian makes yearly? $43,090. I think you can begin to see why Canadians are so angry with Trudeau recently. You literally need to make 3 times the average yearly income in order to qualify for a mortgage. Oh, but somehow it gets even worse. And you really didn't think it could, did you? Enter the tragedy that is the Canadian public healthcare system. Canada's healthcare system is often touted as a point of pride, but the reality many Canadians face tells a very different story. Universal, publicly funded healthcare sounds great on paper. After all, who wouldn't want access to medical care without worrying about the cost? But in economics, there is no such thing as a free lunch. The costs are still there. It's just that you pay them through your taxes instead of directly, thus removing all the incentives a typical market has to improve efficiency, and you get a far worse product in the end. The root of the problem lies in the nature of the system itself. When you make something free, demand inevitably skyrockets. And when demand outpaces supply, as it always does in public healthcare systems, you get shortages. No matter how much money is funneled into the system, it will never be enough to meet everyone's needs. Take wait times, for example. In 2024, the average wait to see a specialist after a referral was over 26 weeks. That's half a year just to get an appointment. Even something as basic as getting a family doctor is out of reach for many Canadians. Nearly 6.5 million people are without one. And for those lucky enough to have a doctor, visits are often rushed, cold, and transactional. Why? Because doctors aren't incentivized to spend time understanding their patients or addressing root causes. Doing so won't change their paycheck. The goal becomes simple: move as many people through the system as quickly as possible. This assembly line approach to healthcare leaves patients feeling dehumanized. Canadians are treated as problems to be processed, not as people with unique needs and concerns. This is a core flaw of every single universal public healthcare system, but especially that of Canada, and nothing exemplifies this approach more than the Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID program. Originally intended as a compassionate option for those facing unbearable suffering, MAID has become a devilish solution to the inefficiencies of the healthcare system. If you aren't incentivized to actually treat your patients, why not just kill them? There are now tons of cases of Canadians being offered euthanasia instead of long-term care, effectively pushing them towards death because it's cheaper for the state than actually providing medical care they need. This is possible because MAID has very quickly expanded far beyond its original intent. It was originally meant to be a last resort option for those facing unbearable suffering from terminal conditions, but has since been expanded to be able to include, well, basically anyone if they want it bad enough. When MAID was first legalized in 2016, eligibility was tightly controlled. The program was only available to adults suffering from a grievous and irremediable medical condition, where natural death was reasonably foreseeable. In 2021, Bill C-7 was passed, removing the requirement that a patient's natural death be reasonably foreseeable. This opened the program to individuals with chronic illnesses or disabilities who were not at immediate risk of dying. Then, in March of 2023, when eligibility for MAID was extended to individuals suffering solely from mental illnesses, and increasingly to many Canadians, it seemed that their doctors would rather have them dead.
A 47-year-old woman who suffered from anorexia all of her life is going to be able to be euthanized next March in Canada.
Saying a Vancouver woman who went to hospital seeking help for suicidal ideation says a clinician told her the system is broken, there are long waits to see a psychiatrist, and have you considered medical assistance in dying? Have you considered using the MAID program as a way out.
Well, there is a startling new development in the ongoing controversy around veterans being offered medical assistance in dying. A retired corporal who is paraplegic shocked MPs in Ottawa yesterday when she told them an employee of Veterans Affairs Canada offered her help with arranging a medically assisted death.
When a Canadian veteran picked up the phone and called Veterans Affairs Canada to get treatment for his combat-related PTSD and a traumatic brain injury, he expected help getting better and getting his life back. Instead, he got an unexpected and unwanted offer to help him end it through medically assisted death.
Even when they don't want you dead, they still don't treat you properly. And if you don't believe me, try getting virtually any kind of preventative care in this system. The public healthcare system, designed to provide universal access to essential services, often focuses on treating acute illnesses and emergencies rather than preventing anything. This is a fundamental flaw in the system, as preventative care is not only more cost-effective, but also improves patient outcomes and reduces the overall strain on healthcare infrastructure. The issue once again lies in the incentive structure of a publicly funded universal system. Preventative measures such as regular checkups, screenings, and early interventions are not prioritized because their benefits are long-term and less immediately measurable. When your emergency rooms are always overcrowded and doctors overworked, the focus shifts to putting bandages on immediate problems rather than mitigating future ones. This leads to a cycle where patients only seek care once their conditions have worsened, resulting in higher costs and worse outcomes. Consider the case of chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease. These conditions can often be managed or fully prevented through early interventions such as dietary counseling, regular monitoring, and lifestyle adjustments. However, in Canada, many patients wait months just to see their primary care physicians, who are often too overworked to provide the comprehensive care necessary for prevention, and just rush them out the door with those typical bandage solutions. For anyone living in a publicly funded healthcare system, you know what I'm talking about. You go to your doctor and you tell them about your issues, only for them to only vaguely half listen and then give you a random prescription which isn't even meant to address what you're describing and rush you out the door only to see the next patient and do the same thing with them. And for the already mentioned 6.5 million Canadians without a family doctor, well, good luck, I guess. And the worst part is that treating people this way isn't even economically efficient. Treating advanced illnesses is significantly more expensive than preventing them. For example, a late-stage cancer diagnosis requires costly treatments like chemotherapy, surgeries, and hospital stays, expenses that could have been avoided or minimized with earlier detection through preventive care, such as regular screenings. Patients often feel abandoned by a system that only addresses their needs when they become severe. The absence of proactive, patient-centered care leaves individuals feeling like statistics rather than people, and that's heartbreaking to see, no matter what your political opinions might be. The tax policy of the Trudeau government can be summed up as, if it moves, tax it. And I wish that was an over-exaggeration. For the average Canadian, it feels like no matter where you turn, there's a tax waiting to take a bite out of your wallet. Income taxes, sales taxes, payroll taxes, excise taxes, property taxes, and that's just the basic taxes. Under Trudeau's government, taxes have not only increased in rate, but have also become more varied, with new taxes introduced that make it feel like you're being charged just for existing. Let's go through these one by one, starting with the basic ones, and trust me, you'll want to watch this section until the very end, because even I had no idea how insane the Canadian government really is when it comes to stealing your money. It is wild. Canada's federal income tax system is progressive, meaning the more you earn, the higher percentage you pay. The federal tax brackets for 2024 are as follows. 15% on the first $53,359 of taxable income, 20.5% on income between $53,359 and $106,717, 26% on income between $106,717 and $165,430, 29% on income between $165,430 and $235,675, and 33% on income over $235,675. But that's just the federal tax. Yeah, that's right. As if taking a third of your income wasn't enough, every province adds its own layer of income tax on top of this. For example, in provinces like Quebec and Nova Scotia, the top combined federal and provincial income tax rate exceeds 50%, which means that the Canadian government effectively steals half of the money that high-income earners make. Half.
Other than to cause, if more government spending were to solve the problems, we wouldn't have 2 million people lined up at food banks and 9 out of 10 young people unable to afford a home. Now they want to quadruple the carbon tax, just as we learn that Canadians will be forced to spend another $700 just to feed themselves.
On top of income tax, Canadians also pay payroll taxes, mandatory contributions to programs like the Canadian Pension Plan, and employment insurance. In 2024, employees pay 5.95% of their income to CPP and 1.63% to EL. Employers match these contributions, effectively doubling the costs. And if you're self-employed, guess what? Now you're paying both the employee and employer taxes, basically meaning you're taxed another 15% on top of the income taxes you're already paying. Wonderful, isn't it? Then we have the business taxes. Trudeau's government has maintained the small business tax rate at 9%, but set the general corporate tax rate at 15%. However, when you add provincial corporate taxes, total rates for businesses can range between 25% and 31%, depending on where the business operates. If you can't quite picture how insane these numbers are, put it this way. If an employer has $100,000 he wants to pay you for your work, after he pays his taxes and then you pay your taxes, depending on where you are located, you might end up with around $50,000 in your pocket. And then it's better not to even think about how much the so-called high-income earners have to fork over. But those were just the straightforward taxes. There are also dozens, if not hundreds, of little hidden taxes on literally everything you buy or do in Canada. And here, I'll just list some of the worst ones that caught my eye. Otherwise, this video would be twice as long as it already is if I decided to list all of them. From 2022 onwards, there is a 10% tax on so-called luxury vehicles worth over $100,000 and a 20% tax on other luxury items such as watches, jewelry, etc. There's a digital services tax, or the DST, which taxes digital services like subscriptions and such at 3%. Then there's the sugar tax, 20 cents per liter on sugar-sweetened beverages. Then you also get taxed if you have a vacant home, aka you own a property that you don't live in. And we can't forget about the actual property tax too. Then, if you are in Vancouver and you aren't a resident, you have to pay an additional 1.25% annual tax on all your properties in addition to all the other crap you're already paying. So not only is your property not actually your own, as you have to effectively pay rent to the government to own it, you also can't decide what to do with it, and are taxed even higher if you decide you don't want to live in it. And wait, what is that music I hear in the background? Oh, Oh, and then it gets fun. We have the sin taxes. Canadians are taxed $8 to $12 per pack of cigarettes they smoke. There are both federal and provincial taxes on alcohol, combining to about 50 to 75% of the retail price of alcohol that was further increased 6.3% in 2023, with even higher rates expected in the future. And there is also a 10% cannabis tax, and so on and so forth. You get the point. There are taxes on plastic bags, from 15 cents to 25 cents per reusable bag. Don't those things cost like less than a cent to make? Canadians also pay so-called eco-fees when purchasing electronics, tires, paint, or anything Trudeau doesn't think regular people should have, supposedly. There are $25 eco-fees on TVs, and it's $4 to $9 on tires, etc. There are even fees for recycling old batteries and electronics. What the f*** is this country where you people get taxed for recycling? Of course, there are taxes for fuel, and then some provinces like British Columbia have transit levies on fuel purchases, which is just another way to punish you for driving. If you want to drive out of town, too bad, because you have to pay toll fees, which can run up to 70 cents per kilometer during peak hours. Yes, that is also, in fact, insane. And we can't forget the vehicle registration taxes, because why should a regular peasant be able to drive his vehicle without paying 10 different types of taxes to the God King Trudeau. And there's also a land transfer tax up to 5% whenever you purchase a home, depending on the province. Some really great ones, like Toronto, have both provincial and municipal transfer taxes, so you have to pay double, essentially. And then, if you want to fly, well, too bad, because you have to pay the airport improvement fees, which range from $10 to $35 per ticker. And that's in addition to federal aviation taxes. You also get taxed for staying in a hotel, 4 to 8% of the nightly room rate. There's also a Netflix tax. Yes, a Netflix tax on things like Netflix, Spotify, Disney Plus, and other digital services. Seriously, Trudeau, what are the peasants supposed to do when they get home from working and sending their entire paycheck to the Soviet Republic of Canada? The federal government also levies a consumption tax called Goods and Services Tax, essentially what a VAT is in other countries at 5%. But then, provinces set their own harmonized sales taxes at volumes from 13% to 15%. Oh, I cannot figure out why everything is so expensive in Canada.
After 8 years of Justin Trudeau, life costs more, work doesn't pay, housing costs have doubled, crime, chaos, drugs and disorder are common in our streets.
When you combine federal income taxes, provincial income taxes, payroll deductions, sales taxes, and these niche taxes, I wouldn't be surprised if Canadians spent 2/3 or even 3/4 of everything they earn on taxes, either directly or indirectly, because this is just, wow. Even if we underestimate this by a lot, by ignoring all of these random little taxes and say that only half of what you as a Canadian make ends up in the hands of the government, that means that effectively from January all the way till July of every single year, you are working solely for the government. And only in the latter half of the year, you get to make money for yourself. I'm not an expert, but that sounds an awful lot like slavery. Oh, and you thought we were done with taxes? Ha! Trudeau has one last ace up his sleeve, and that is the carbon tax. This is perhaps the second most controversial policy of the Trudeau government right here. These taxes are designed to make fossil fuels more expensive in an effort to reduce carbon emissions. The idea is simple. If you make it more expensive to pollute, people and companies will use cleaner energy sources. Sounds good on paper, right? No, of course not, but let's take it step by step. First, what exactly is a carbon tax? It's a tax on the carbon content of fuels. The more CO2 a fuel produces when it's burned, the higher the tax. This applies on things like gasoline, diesel, and natural gas. Here's how it works in reality. When you fill up your car with gas, you're paying a bit more at the pump. In 2023, Canada's federal carbon tax is $65 per ton of CO2 emissions. This means that every liter of gasoline now has an additional 14 cents added to its price. And it doesn't stop there, as this tax will continue to rise by $15 per ton every year, eventually reaching $170 per ton by 2030. And as we've mentioned earlier, it's not just gas prices going up, because virtually everything needs energy to be produced, transported, or sold. It means that the prices of everything go up even further. And all of this hits regular Canadians the most, as businesses adjust their prices to reflect their new costs. Canadians living far in rural areas from urban centers are probably hit the hardest, not only because they depend on cars far more, but also because it requires more fuel to get the same goods in their grocery stores as opposed to the big cities. While Trudeau's carbon tax might sound like a good idea for the environment, it comes with a gigantic designer price tag for the average Canadian. And that is at a time where it seems they can least afford it. This tax really is a nail to the coffin for the Canadian economy, as domestic industries are forced to deal with rising production costs and consumers get stuck with the bill. You're paying extra for your own country's goods. And for what? A cleaner planet? No, not even that. As even if Canada was 100% carbon neutral, it wouldn't really make a difference whatsoever. We've already touched upon this in the housing section, but it's worth having its own section just because of how much this actually hurts Canada. Canada's regulatory environment has become so complicated, restrictive. It's downright absurd. It's hindering growth so much that it is insane. We can see this best when comparing Canada to the United States. These two countries have kind of been seen as siblings throughout history, with Canada's relationship being compared to being America's little sister. Around 10 years ago, the American and Canadian median incomes were virtually tied, with Canadians even being slightly better off than Americans. Today, the American per capita GDP is around $22,000 higher than that of Canada. And to that, we should add that American real estate is on average much cheaper than Canadian, making that difference hit even harder. As Canada's regulatory state has expanded, its growth has shrunk. We've already talked about the construction industry, so take the oil and gas industry as an example. Trudeau's government has implemented strict emissions regulations that make it harder and more expensive for companies to extract oil and gas. These industries are effectively being suffocated, and Canada is forced to import oil and natural gas from abroad, even though it has the third largest oil reserves in the entire world right beneath its feet. To make matters worse for the energy sector, Trudeau's government has imposed countless restrictions on pipeline construction, despite the fact that these pipelines are one of the safest and most efficient ways to transport oil and gas. Trudeau has consistently delayed or blocked pipeline projects, which not only prevented costs from falling through more efficient transportation, but also increased costs by creating capital and investment uncertainty. For instance, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which was initially approved, faced years of regulatory challenges and opposition, causing delays and billions in extra costs. These kinds of regulatory bullshit has made it harder for Canada to fully utilize its natural resources and be competitive on the global stage. This anti-business attitude doesn't just extend to the energy and construction sectors. Trudeau just seems to hate businesses in general, which isn't exactly great when you're trying to run a country and grow its economy. By their fruits you shall know them. There's been a downright Orwellian Red Tape Reduction Act passed by Trudeau's government in 2015, which did basically nothing to reduce red tape, and in some cases actually increased it. Much of the regulatory reduction touted by the government involved removing regulations that were already obsolete or rarely enforced, leaving what is really burdening businesses basically untouched, and businesses saw no actual reduction in compliance costs or time required. Rather than actually eliminating burdensome regulations, the government often replaced them with informal procedures or guidelines. These non-regulatory rules are technically outside the scope of the act, but functionally operate as red tape, and businesses must still adhere to these informal policies to avoid penalties, audits, or loss of licensing, which makes compliance even more vague and confusing, and probably just serves to make business owners want to pull their hairs out whenever they look at their books. It's even worse for small businesses who don't have on-hand lawyers or legal teams to help them navigate this administrative hellscape. And here comes the big one, and the most controversial one. Back in 2015, when Justin Trudeau took office, his promise of a progressive, inclusive, and welcoming Canada resonated with Canadians. I mean, he won the election after all. Canada was hailing as a global leader in compassion and opportunity, opening its doors wide for newcomers from all over the world. But as we fast forward to 2024, Canadians have a different attitude.
Canada's open door, not so open anymore.
We didn't get the balance quite right.
Let's talk numbers, because the scale of this issue is staggering. In 2023, Canada's population grew by over 1.2 million people, the largest single-year increase in its history. Of those, 431,645 were permanent residents, and an additional 800,000 were temporary residents, including international students and workers. Over 1 million new people in 1 year. That's like plopping an entire city the size of Calgary into the country without building any extra houses, schools, hospitals, or roads to accommodate them because, as we have described, builders aren't actually allowed to build anything new. Here's the problem. Canada wasn't ready for this. It's one thing to welcome people with open arms, it's another to actually have the infrastructure to support them. Rents have skyrocketed, with urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver seeing increases of 30 to 50% since 2015. Public services are collapsing under the additional strain, and it doesn't look like it'll get any better, chief of which being the healthcare system. The overload of new workers wouldn't really be too much of a problem in a truly free market, as the increased demand would very quickly be met with increased supply. But that just can't happen in Canada because of overbearing government regulation and restrictions. And then there's the job market. Immigrants were supposed to fill labor shortages, but instead, many are stuck in low paying or part time jobs, while native born Canadians face increased competition and stagnant wages. If you're a young Canadian just starting your life out, I'm sorry, but the deck is stacked against you. The public mood has shifted dramatically. In 2015, 39% of Canadians believed immigration levels were too high. Today, that number has soared to over 70%, and it's not hard to see why. Many Canadians feel displaced in their own communities, watching housing prices soar and public services deteriorate while their government continues to prioritize high immigration targets. Trudeau's vision of an open, inclusive Canada may have been noble, but in reality, the changes might not be reversible. The irony is that immigration was supposed to solve Canada's problems: aging demographics, labor shortages, and economic stagnation. Instead, it has made it much worse. To conclude this whole thing, because at this point I'm extremely frustrated even though I'm not even Canadian, Canada is f***ed. Thanks for watching. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this, as it would really mean a lot to me. And don't forget to tell me how I'm wrong about all this in the comments down below. In the comments down below.